Hello! We're going to be covering Chapter 7, Part 1 in this video lecture. We'll be looking at specifically enterprise crime or mafia-related crimes and contropreneurial crime, which is the crimes that con men and con women tend to perpetrate. So let's talk about enterprise crime. It refers to the interrelated activities between organized crime, i.e. the mob, and legitimate businesses. Because once you get all of this ill-gotten money, how do you make it work for you? You have to put it into a legitimate business. It's also known as syndicate crime, and if you read a lot of government reports, they tend to refer to it as a syndicate, not as the mob or the mafia. Here's a picture of one of the big mafia guys from the 20th century. Vito Genovese. He was the head of the Genovese crime family and syndicate. In New York, there were the 5 families, and he was one of the most important. Characteristics of enterprise crime. And basically, if you've seen The Godfather, it kind of tells you what you need to know. Limited membership with a strong management hierarchy. Everybody knows who's in charge. Conspires to gain a monopoly over certain illegal activities in a particular area, especially drugs, gambling, pimping, prostitution, those kind of activities. Tend to use violence or threats of violence to achieve their objectives. That's really the main difference between white-collar criminals and the criminals that you see in the mob or mafia. Is white-collar criminals are not inclined to use violence as much as they can, whereas the mafia tends to relish the violence. The goal is to achieve a large-scale financial risk with a large-scale financial gain with a minimum of risk. And lastly, protects itself by corrupting the legal and political system within which it works. In other words, they're bribing the cops, they're bribing the politicians. This is John Gotti, formerly the head of the Gambino crime family and syndicate. He was known as the Dapper Don because he always wore very expensive suits out in public. One of the other things that John Gotti was well known for was taking care of his neighborhood. He threw all kinds of street fairs, and he paid for older people to have food, and he made sure that the streets were clear after a snowstorm. So pretty much everyone in the neighborhood loved him and didn't really care that he came to power through killing people. So how much does the mob actually make, money-wise? It's been estimated that syndicate crime accounts for between $50 billion and $250 billion in the U.S. economy. That's about 1% of our gross national product, which is a pretty significant amount of money, much of which makes its way into the economy and legitimate businesses. And in this PowerPoint, you're going to see how that works. Here's some just interesting things that I thought you would be interested in, and these are Russian mobsters. And one of the big things that Russian mobsters do is they use blue ink to tattoo themselves, and that helps distinguish them in jail from the other criminals who just use regular old black ink. Russian mobster tattoos are very symbolic, and they have some significant meaning. If you're interested in tattoos, just the tattoos that Russian mobsters use have been written about extensively because they have so much symbolic meaning. So let's look at the history of organized crime, not just, the mafia, the Italians, but everybody. So if you want to look at the earliest representations of organized crime, you'd have to go back to ancient Greece about 2,500 years ago. And that's when piracy began. Piracy is, in a sense, organized crime, and it existed as far back as ancient Greece and probably even earlier than that. But we have historians writing about ancient Greece and historians writing about the piracy. Organized crime really flourished in London in the 15 and 1600s, and this is when pickpockets and bribing officials became really just the meat and potatoes of organized crime in those days. And of course, it moved over to the United States. By the end of the 1600s, the Massachusetts colony in the U.S. had a flourishing organized crime presence. And of course, most of the folks who were in Massachusetts had come over from England and Ireland. Even our historical heroes were engaged in some measure of organized crime. John Hancock, famous American, there's his name right there, on the Declaration of Independence, signed it prominently so that the King of England would have no doubt who had signed this. He was operating an organized smuggling cartel in the meantime, which at the time was not seen as necessarily a bad thing, because we didn't like the British. So let's talk about the actual Mafia, because those are the guys that most of us are pretty familiar with through the movies and TV shows. Originated in southern Italy in the 1500s, keeping in mind that northern Italy was economically very well off at the time. It was towards the end of the Renaissance. The great banking and artistic and trade opportunities that were available in northern Italy were not available in southern Italy. So the southern Italians began to organize, and then eventually they made their way to the United States at the end of the 1800s. When you look at great moments in Mafia history, the one that really stands out is the constitutional amendment for Prohibition. And this outlawed the sale of liquor in the United States from 1919 until it was repealed in 1935. And this gave the Mafia and other mobs the opportunity to manage and control the distribution of alcohol. Prohibition was intended to stem the tide of drunkenness and broken families, but in reality what it did was actually open up crime to a never before seen level. And the mob basically got involved and took advantage and managed the whole thing. It was a boon to the mobsters of the 1920s. So let's talk about Prohibition in more detail. It allowed for the expansion of syndicated crime. It also created a connection between the underworld of criminals and the upper world of politicians and the wealthy. So think about it. You're a politician or you're a wealthy businessman, and you have been having your martini every night since you were 12 years old. And now all of a sudden alcohol is illegal. Is that going to stop you, some rich guy, from having your martini? Of course not. Because in the same way today that really rich guys who want access to drugs have someone they call, these really rich guys from back in the day had someone they called, and this person would bring them cases and cases of alcohol. What this did was it created a relationship between the underworld and the upper world. And if you were smart and lucky and you knew how to manipulate people, you became somebody like Joseph Kennedy, who was President John F. Kennedy's father. He made his fortune bootlegging, and his wealth allowed his son to move into the upper ranks of politics, eventually becoming president. Keeping in mind that his other son became a senator from Massachusetts, that's Ted Kennedy, and his other son, Robert Kennedy, became the U.S. Attorney General. So he didn't do so bad in terms of fathering some pretty amazing young men. However, everyone and their mother knows that the reason they had the money to do all these things is because Dad was a big old mobster. So let's jump ahead to World War II. During World War II, 1941 to 1945, mobsters engaged in all manner of white-collar crime. It was a boom time for mobsters. They could control the gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, which is another way of saying controlling the unions, real estate fraud, theft and sale of securities, stocks and bonds. And if any of you are fans of The Great Gatsby, that is in fact how Jay Gatsby becomes so rich. He is a mobster who gets involved in selling liquor in his pharmacies under the table, of course, during Prohibition, and then moves into stealing securities and selling them. Then we also have cigarette bootlegging, which to this day is still a popular mob-related activity. In an interesting side note, the U.S. government asked Lucky Luciano, who was one of the big mob guys at the time, to help identify German spies on the waterfront docks because he controlled the Union. So even the U.S. government knew the mob was doing the whole labor racketeering, but rather than fighting them during World War II, they basically asked them for help. So one of the things that you may not have thought about specifically, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Most of these syndicates are based on a person's ethnicity. The biggest mob groups in the U.S. today, and again, not including the Italians because that's been kind of beaten to death, but the Russians, the Jamaicans, Hispanics, especially Cubans and Colombians, and then various affiliated Asian and African American groups. This wonderfully sweet-looking old lady over here, her name is Griselda Blanco. She is part of the Colombian Mafia. She lived in Miami, and she was known as the cocaine godmother. She was essentially in charge of bringing in all the cocaine from Colombia that made its way through Florida, which was quite a bit. And she was also known as pretty bloodthirsty. She was responsible for ordering more than 200 murders and committing quite a few herself, including killing one of her husbands. She had 4 sons, all of whom were killed at some point in drug-related activities. And then she herself was killed in a drive-by in 2012. So, yeah, we tend to think of, men, vicious, violent-looking men as the people who are running the mob. But, you can be a sweet old grandma and still be running a mobster, too. So why are they ethnically based? And this is when we get into some of the sociological research. And they've come to the conclusion that syndicates, or mobs, provide a ladder of mobility for immigrant and minority groups because they are not welcomed into the traditional ways of accessing the ladder of American success. If you look at the Irish mob, by the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, the Irish mob was very powerful. But as the Irish moved into mainstream positions of power, the mob became less important and became not as significant in terms of the way to achieve success in this country. So why do these groups feel like they are not being welcomed into the United States with open arms? Well, we don't have a very good history of welcoming people with open arms. Researchers have suggested that the activities of these ethnically based syndicates are consistent with white-collar crimes of corporations, but they are treated more harshly because of the inherent bias against minority groups in the U.S. Here are some pictures from the 1950s and early 60s in the United States. Whites only, telephone booth, drinking fountain, white on one side, colored on the other. And then this is a picture of a bus, and what you'll see in the back is where the African Americans were allowed to sit and the white people were only sitting in the front. So in a nutshell, these groups are not welcomed with open arms into the areas where they could be successful in the United States, so they make their own opportunities. And if they have to break a few laws to do that, oh well. Squash competition by acquiring competitors in order to create monopolies, engaged in price gouging, shocking, and sold stock at inflated prices to unsuspecting investors, and then destroyed the company for which the stock was issued and bankrupted the investors. And this is one of the big things that the Russians are doing today. So these Americans, in addition to the 3 men listed over there on the side, also include Rockefeller and Duke. And again, Duke, there's a university. So, these are the men that really were just off the hook in the 1800s. They were just crooked, ruthless businessmen, and now we look at them as heroes. So, of course, these mobster guys are going to look at these illegal opportunities as a way of becoming part of the American fabric. So in a sense, you could even say that criminal business enterprise is the way to become a great American. So let's talk about how syndicates work with legitimate businesses. The ultimate goal for many syndicates is to move their money into a legitimate business for a variety of reasons. So let's say you're making all your money selling drugs. But are drugs legal? No. So you need to figure out a way to legitimize your money. So one of the things that a lot of guys do, and this was very popular with the Italian Mafia, was opening up restaurants. So you open up a restaurant. First of all, this provides a legal front to your business. So if you make $10,000 a week selling drugs, you could then claim that money as restaurant income, which, and this is our second point, allows them to pay taxes on their illegal activities. Because if you remember all the great moments in mobster justice, it often relates to the fact that these folks didn't pay their taxes. The IRS came after them. It also provides employment for family members and associates who are on parole. It's very hard once you're on parole or probation to get a good job. And you can't exactly be working for the mob if you're on parole. So if you have a legitimate restaurant and your cousin Vinny is working there as a dishwasher, that is a legitimate job. The fact that cousin Vinny is also selling drugs out on the street and making a nice income for you is beside the point. The other thing is that they can transfer businesses to their heirs. So you, as a mafia guy with your restaurant, you want to leave it to your children one day. You want to leave the entire quote-unquote business to your children one day. This allows you to do that. And then, much like what Joseph Kennedy did, it allows them to gain entry into the legitimate business world and greater respectability. Because no matter how much people enjoy living on the fringe, everybody wants to be a power player. They want to be able to get their way just because they're that important. So, modern businesses that you would see the mafia heavily involved in: auto sales, and I'm not talking about Honda or Toyota, I'm talking about used car sales. Very mobbed up. Health insurance companies, small ones, very mobbed up. Prepaid telephone cards. This is one of those great gimmicks where they can steal a bunch of them, resell them to the bodegas at the corner in the city, and they've made all the money. Construction and building trades, still run by the Italian Mafia in many cases. Meat processing plants, just think about that the next time you eat your hot dog. Garment factories, stock brokerages, and that's again where the Russian mobs are really becoming very rich, is by selling this worthless stock, and it's usually called penny stock. Software and film piracy. Our Chinese friends, our Chinese mob friends, are very involved in this. And then toxic waste disposal. The Italians have always been very heavily involved in waste management, the garbage trucks. Now they're getting into toxic waste disposal, which is supposed to be disposed of in very specific ways. There's a lot of regulations. And do you think these guys are paying any attention to the regulations? Of course not. They're just getting rid of the toxic waste wherever they can. So you'll often hear in the news conversations about illegal dumping, and that's where that comes from. So let's look at some of the financial crime that these syndicates have been perpetrating. They do the pump and dump of stocks. You artificially inflate the value of a stock, you push it out to the world as fast as you can, and then once the brokerage house has made its money, you allow the stock price to plummet. Mortgage fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Very significant, and these are really where you make your most money these days. So here's how money laundering works. So you have somebody who collects the dirty money. They put it in the bank. The bank integrates it into the financial system. Then we need to layer things. They transfer the money from the bank to a company, Company X. Company X wire transfers to an offshore bank. So, for example, your bank, let's just say your TD Bank, transfers the money to your Company X. Company X, and again, is this cash? No, it's a wire transfer. It's no cash is involved once it's been deposited. Now it's in part of the bank. So the money gets transferred to the bank account of Company X, and then it's wired to an offshore bank, probably in the Cayman Islands, that then loans the money to Company Y, and then Company Y pays Company X the money using a false invoice. And so X, who is also this guy, is now able to spend his money, which has been laundered and clean and has no reflection of mobster money because it's actually payment for services rendered, to buy his car, motorcycle, jet ski, or beautiful helicopter that we all need. Now we're going to talk about a term called Contrepreneurs. And what this means is a con man who's also an entrepreneur. These are professional criminals who avoid violence and avoid arrest by bribing people. These are very non-violent offenders. They're not looking to beat anyone up. Their activities include theft, including major pickpocket groups, shoplifting, switching jewels on inspection, hotel burglaries, check forging, credit card fraud, shakedowns. And shakedowns do tend to involve some threat of violence. And then the big con, swindling individuals or groups while appearing to be engaged in legitimate business. For those of you who are big Leonardo DiCaprio fans, if you've ever seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, this is Frank Abagnale, and he is the man who Leonardo DiCaprio's character is modeled after. And he is one of the biggest con artists in the history of the United States. But he looks so trustworthy, right? He's got the nice hair, he's got nice French cuffs, he's got his little pocket square. He looks very Wall Street, doesn't he? But he's as crooked as they come. Now, there are just a million different ways that con men can get us. The biggest ones are these phony charities, phony contests, travel deceptions, and what are called Nigerian emails. And if you haven't received one of these emails, you will eventually. And basically what it says is, hello, I'm a God-fearing Christian, of course, because Christians would never lie, and I need to take $100 million out of my country that my husband has squirreled away, but I cannot because he is under house arrest, so I need your banking information and I will transfer the money to your account and you get to keep half. Of course. So this sounds ridiculous, and to most people it is ridiculous. But what you see is certain populations of people, i.e. vulnerable groups, tend to believe this. So who are the victims? The elderly, the poor, the unemployed, people who want to get rich quick, and probably the saddest group, a lot of times who are taken in by these frauds, are recent immigrants looking to fast-track their citizenship or visas. So you've been in the United States a few weeks, you want to live here forever, and someone contacts you and says, I can help speed up your citizenship for $20,000. Well, a lot of these people come from countries where bribery is standard operating procedure. So, of course, they hand over the money and then never hear from the person again. And, unfortunately, what this does is it really sets people back even further. And why don't they complain? Well, they're usually too embarrassed to pursue a legal case against these con artists. The bottom line is, if something sounds too good to be true, it is. Anything that sounds too good to be true is a scam. So now we're going to talk about Ponzi schemes. They're named after Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant who in 1919 perpetrated a postal fraud. He promised clients a 50% profit within 45 days or a 100% profit within 90 days by buying discounted postal reply coupons in other countries and redeeming them at face value in the US. They don't use these anymore, so it's kind of hard to explain, but essentially what he's doing is he's using the post replies as currency, and he's saying that if he buys them in other countries and brings them to the US, he can redeem them for twice their face value. Well, the reality was, of course you cannot do that. And he eventually lost his investors about $20 million. So the way that the Ponzi scheme works is this is Charles Ponzi up here. He convinces two people to give him money to do this. These two people will eventually get their money back because he then gets four more people to give him money. When these folks give him the money, he gives the original two investors their money back with a healthy profit. These two guys will probably tell these 8 guys what a great investment this was. So these 8 guys clamor to put their money in this scheme. So when these guys put their money in this scheme, that money then goes back to these 4 guys plus a small profit. And again, what you're seeing is anything that's left over, Charles Ponzi is taking for himself. Now, this is with 8 people. Imagine doing this with millions or hundreds of thousands of people. In 1919, Charles Ponzi's investors lost $20 million. Kind of putting that in today's money, you're looking at a very healthy hundreds of millions of dollars lost. Today, we have Bernie Madoff as the king of the Ponzi scheme. In 2009, Madoff pled guilty to 11 counts related to a $65 billion, that's billion with a B, Ponzi scheme he had run. It's considered to be the largest Ponzi scheme ever uncovered. The video assignment that you're watching this weekend goes into great detail about how it was done and why it went so long without people realizing it. But one of the biggest issues is the fact that people really trusted Bernie Madoff. He was a very respected, highly influential figure in the money world of New York. And he ran a legitimate business, and then he just happened to be doing this illegitimate Ponzi scheme on the side. Another option in the world of criminal behavior for mobsters and con men and legitimate business is called a pyramid scheme. A pyramid scheme is a business model that involves promising participants payment or services primarily for enrolling other people into the scheme rather than supplying any real investment or sale of products. So you make money by selling people on the idea. They give you money to get information about the idea. You see this a lot with work-at-home schemes. Send me $20 and I'll share with you my secret on how to work from home. So you send the guy $20 and you get a pamphlet that's not worth the money the paper is printed on that basically tells you to go ahead, put an ad in the newspaper or the internet and sit back and collect $20 from every person who wants this information, and you send them this pamphlet. That's it. That's all that's required. The idea here is people are not legitimately getting a product or service. What they're really getting is how to run a pyramid scheme. And you make no money, and you make money, but eventually people are going to stop investing. Herbalife is a big pyramid scheme that's been in court multiple times. They do sell some products, but they're really based on the idea of a pyramid scheme. Other fraudulent schemes, and we've talked about a lot of these, investment frauds with penny stocks and metal mines. If you think about it, hey, you want to invest in a mine in the Congo. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Well, most of us are not going to get on a plane and fly to Africa and check out the mine in Congo. We're going to just say, well, I trust this guy, so here's my $10,000. When in reality, the mine in the Congo is currently underground and not been touched, and no one's going to touch it ever. So you're out your 10 grand. Home improvement and ownership frauds. Contractors have had a lot of complaints placed against them because some of them are, in fact, con artists. One of the biggest ones you're hearing about now are these guys who go around cleaning the vents in your house. They put an ad in the paper, $200 to clean your vent. They come in, they make everybody leave the house, they put on these nice white jumpsuits, and you come back in 2 hours and you have no idea if your vents have been cleaned, and usually they have not. Because the guy who showed up sits down, pulls out a magazine, and reads for the 2 hours that he has told you that he's going to be working very hard. Another big one is the mortgage fraud with straw home buyers, land sale frauds, travel scams. Travel scams, the vacation you won has so many restrictions that the winners would end up spending exorbitant amounts of money to upgrade their vacation. Payday loans. Unbelievable. Payday loans are one of the worst things, and they're so bad that 12 states have actually banned them. These payday loans can run an annual percentage interest rate of 500%. Now, to put this in context, a credit card that we would consider ridiculously high interest runs 20% a year. So, in this case, using a credit card would in fact be way better than using a payday loan. I cannot stress to you enough that payday loans are a big, big ripoff. Another one is fraudulent debt relief companies. Although they promise to help you manage your debt and your credit score, once they gain access to your accounts, you are swindled out of what little money you have. How do you prevent yourself from getting engaged in something like that? Check with the Better Business Bureau. Find out if a company is a good company. Google them on the internet. Ask for people's opinions. Look at a site like Yelp that gives people the opportunity to review a company. These are the ways to make sure you're not getting ripped off. Scams. Scams are all over the place. Employment agencies who charge an upfront fee and guarantee employment are usually scamming you. A good employment agency will not either A, charge an upfront fee, they're going to take a percentage of whatever your rate is, and they do not guarantee employment. If they guarantee employment, that's kind of one of those too good to be true moments. Telemarketing scams. These are the characteristics. Smooth delivery on the phone to generate trust. They're going to chat you up. They're going to have a nice long conversation about your grandchildren and about the thing you have growing on your arm and anything else. They're going to be nice. They're going to be friendly. They're going to persuade you to give them a credit card number. And then you're never going to hear from them again, because once they get your information, they can then use that to steal your identity or to just steal your credit card and buy a whole bunch of stuff that they can then resell. So this is our last slide for this chapter, part 1, chapter 7, part 1. And this is one of my favorite stories of a con man. So we've all heard of NSync. We've all heard of the Backstreet Boys. What do they have in common? They were both managed by the same guy. This guy's Lou Pearlman. There he is in both pictures. Oh, look, there he is in handcuffs. Pearlman swindled U.S. banks and investors out of $300 million by inviting them to invest money into a fictitious company over the course of a decade. And here's what he was doing. People trusted him. He was the manager of the two biggest groups at the time in the 90s. Everybody knew NSync and Backstreet Boys. And so people trusted that when they gave him money to invest, they were not only going to get a profit out of it, but that this was a legitimate businessman. He was found guilty on 2 counts of conspiracy, money laundering, and using false statements in a bankruptcy proceeding. And he was sentenced to 25 years in jail. Now, there was also some question about him molesting children, so I think that might have played into how many years he got in jail. But here is a perfect example of a con man who strikes lucky, becomes the manager of 2 very significant groups, and is still conning people for while he's doing all this. So he's got his legitimate business and his illegitimate business. And eventually he did get caught. So that's it. Our quiz is Monday. If you have any questions, please feel free to text message me or email me. And I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.